Once we have a good understanding of RPI and its impact on achieving organizational outcomes using communication, we may be able to take a step back and look at some of the origins of effective communication. Now, those origins are actually rooted in rhetoric. There's not a perfect definition for rhetoric. Any number of different philosophers of communication have tried to establish definitions. What's helpful about rhetoric is that you can keep in mind that it's the act of communicating and all that it encompasses. So let's say, for example, I'm an advertiser and I'd like to have an audience think about purchasing my product. What goes into that process? That's rhetoric. So I'm considering a color scheme, I'm considering a time of the advertisement, I'm considering a message strategy. So all of that is grounded in rhetoric. Now, another philosophical question that is helpful for effective communicators is just understanding when communication begins. Now, most of us might assume that communication begins with an utterance. In other words, the moment I begin speaking or the moment I begin typing, that's communication beginning. But if you think about it carefully, if I had a meeting at 9:30 in the morning, my mindset is probably going to be about that meeting from the time I wake up. So really, communication is beginning not with the utterance, but what we're going to call as, oddly enough, the call. So we're being called into a rhetorical situation, which I'll introduce in a moment. But it's helpful for me to understand that communication happens far in advance of an actual utterance. Most of us plan, most of us spend some time in thought about how we're going to use the time provided to accomplish what we want to accomplish. The second part of this discussion as an origin of rhetoric or the foundation of effective communication is just where exactly does communication occur? Now, some conservative estimates suggest that we're exposed to 6,000 messages a day. Now, that includes every communication message, every verbal utterance. Obviously, we have to filter out much of that information. But when we think about where effective communication occurs, it happens in the between. So the two betweens. I have some examples that might bring this to light, but I think it's helpful just to think about this as far as organizational leadership. If I'm a communicator that wants to ensure that my time is spent effectively, then the moment I'm called into a rhetorical situation, meaning called into a meeting, called into a moment in which I need to send a message that's effective, I start thinking about who my audience is, what type of message I'd like to use, if humor is appropriate or not. And so that's the beginning of communication. And then, of course, when I have a moment of meeting with my audience, then that moment in the between is actually where communication is occurring. So let's give this another framework. I mentioned the rhetorical situation. Sometimes we call this the rhetorical triangle for obvious purposes, but it's composed of three simple structures. We have a speaker, or in more contemporary times, a communicator, that's attempting to convey some type of message to an audience. Now, if you go back to the 5th century, we start seeing different persuasive appeals appear in these three sections. But for our purposes, it's helpful to know that the rhetorical situation is composed of these three parts. Now, what you can accomplish within these three parts is incredibly dynamic. Thinking about an opportunity to speak, for example, we can use that to inform. Or we can see the rhetorical situation evolve into an argument across different interlocutors or people who are actually participating in this rhetorical situation. We can see the rhetorical situation be used for entertaining or reinforcing an idea that had already been introduced in the past. Long story short, it is dynamic, and the hope is we use this to your advantage, meaning that I'm processing what is it that I'd like to accomplish when I'm entering or called into the rhetorical situation, so that my audience can leave the rhetorical situation having been influenced or having been informed or having been entertained or whatever it is that I like to accomplish. To underscore the point as to where communication begins and where it occurs, I'd like to show a very brief clip from the movie The Great Gatsby. So this is the 2013 edition, and the clip that we're going to watch involves the request that Jay Gatsby has of Nick Carraway for Nick Carraway to welcome Daisy Buchanan to tea with Jay Gatsby. And so if you're unfamiliar with the story, Jay Gatsby is a very wealthy neighbor of Nick Carraway, And Nick Carraway doesn't really know why that he's being requested to invite his cousin, Daisy Buchanan, to tea. But we'll watch this clip and try to pay particular attention to where communication begins and where it occurs or how it occurs.
I can't wait all day. I'm leaving.
Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4.
No one's coming to tea. It's too... Yeet, yeet.
It's her.
Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one?
Yes, it suits me.
Why did I have to come alone? Are you in love with me?
Oh, it's the secret of Caraway Castle. Tell your chauffeur to go far away.
Come back in an hour, Ferdy. His name is Ferdy. Oh. Oh. Goodness. I can't believe it. Did you ransack a greenhouse? He is in love with me. Would you?
That's funny.
What's funny?
What are you doing?
I'm certainly glad to see you again.
I'm certainly glad to see you as well.
Okay, so the first question, when does communication between Daisy and Jay begin? Well, Jay Gatsby had been planning this moment probably for years. And so he's been strategizing, and then of course he leveraged his neighbor Nick Carraway in an effort to meet Daisy. However, for Daisy, communication really begins when she first notices and locks eyes with Jay Gatsby. And I think it was about 30 seconds of nonverbal communication before we hear a very benign utterance of, well, I'm very glad to see you. Obviously, there seems to be something under the surface. And so for our rhetorical understanding, communication had begun well before that very benign verbal phrase of, it's very happy to see you, it's very nice to see you again. So we learn communication effectiveness from this scenario because of where the rhetorical situation begins, and then the word interlocutor, meaning both Jay and Daisy entering into this space. And then, of course, what's going to happen next is what makes the story so great. Another model in contemporary communication that tries to advance beyond the rhetorical situation is a very basic linear communication model. And you can see on the screen, the model is composed of a sender that develops a message sent across a medium to reach a destination. Now, if we were automatons, if we were not human, that seems to lend itself well for analysis, especially quantitative analysis. But the problem is, or maybe the opportunity is, that we're not all pre-programmed automatons, at least not yet. And even if AI is trying to change that, I imagine we still have an opportunity to keep humanity in our communication activities. what is presented by the human part of this equation is what's known as the filter. Now, that's a very new term applied to experiences, context, attitudes, predispositions that allow audiences to interpret messages. So if we think about this, going back to our first discussion point, that we're called into communication, we are called into with an infrastructure to learn how to communicate. Now, all of those messages that we absorb as we're growing up in different social situations help us form our values, help us form our predispositions and our attitudes. So as we grow older and we're exposed to more messages, some of which that are coming from different sources than the ones in which we've grown up into, now we're interpreting those messages differently. And so from a democracy point of view, that's wonderful because it means a welcoming of diverse perspectives, diverse attitudes, and then when those diverse points meet, then we have discussions, we have conversations. And from the filter's perspective, a conversation is the only activity in which you get to start to reconcile difference. But this communication model, specifically the focus on the filter, meaning that all human beings have these unique attributes, these unique viewpoints, because they'd been born into and called into socializing groups, which then allowed them to cultivate their own unique experiences and attitudes and beliefs. And that has a massive impact on how we're interpreting messages. Logically, then, if we are looking at how diversity is cultivated from this first principles perspective, meaning that we've been called into our unique socializing groups, then when a meeting of difference occurs, that should be a productive space, right? Unfortunately, that has not always been the case. So for an example of this, I'll pose the question, in addition to some of their politically right-leaning associations, what common denominator do these leaders share? So you might recognize at least one, two, or maybe some of you recognize all three, but that's Condoleezza Rice, Ben Carson on the far right, and Christine Lagarde in the middle. The other common denominator, besides being a right-leaning politician in some capacity, is that all were disinvited to speak at a university event following organizational stakeholder backlash. Now, a disinvitation is much different than a non-invitation, meaning that we had groups of people who put in time, resources, and energy to extend an invitation to some of these esteemed leaders. And because of other organizational stakeholder viewpoints, we decided not to listen and instead propel or expel that particular voice at a university. Now, we could have a very robust conversation as to why that might have happened, but it's helpful for us as leaders to think through what are some of the barriers to welcoming diversity and difference, and should those barriers exist or should they be welcomed given what we just talked about with filters. That might be some food for thought for organizational leaders trying to effectively communicate. To guide us along that discussion, it might be helpful for us to once again return to ancient Greece, where we saw the birthplace of rhetoric as well as a birthplace of civilized philosophy, and turn to the two pillars that ancient Greek societies leaned on when it came to public speech and debate. The first pillar was known as isagoria. Now, isagoria suggests that all citizens of Greek city-states maintain the right to participate in public debate. Now, that right was not violated by socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, profession. You have the right. As long as you are a citizen, you have the right to speak. The second pillar is known as parrhesia. Parrhesia suggests that all citizens have the right to speak their mind in a course of a public debate. Now, if you're asked to speak your mind, of course, that might be a very emotional, off the cusp of your sleeve statement. Keep in mind that isagoria and parrhesia, regardless of welcoming all types of free speech, did not happen in a vacuum. In fact, the precursor to isagoria and parrhesia was the idea of speaking virtuously. In other words, Aristotle, Socrates, and some of the great philosophers suggested that if you have the right to speak, speak with prudence, speak with temperaments, know what it is that you're talking about. In those instances, we don't have just spouting off discriminatory or hateful language. that Aristotle would flag that immediately and say, no, the right to speak and speak your mind does not mean that you abandon temperance, that you abandon prudence, that you abandon wisdom. And so there is room for interpretation just about where we demarcate lines of free speech. I know recently at certain universities, we've had a backlash of some organizational leaders forgetting as to where that line might be drawn. But it is helpful for us to recognize these two pillars leading toward free speech, but with the understanding that virtue is the precursor to all of it.